The faint clink of my son Ryan's glass still echoed on the marble, as the forged deed he hid from me came into view. Still, I steadied my breathing, letting that tiny sound settle instead of letting anger rise. As the clink replayed in my ears, it grew sharper, like the moment our father-son bond finally cracked. While it lingered, I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was Ryan testing how far betrayal could bend blood. The same echo told me he never wanted property. He wanted power over his own father. That's when I decided a father's justice lands softly, but it lands true. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Greg adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo as he stood in front of the hotel mirror, taking in the reflection of a man who looked composed on the outside but carried a quiet storm beneath the surface. At 58, with silver threading his temples and the weight of decades spent building a successful life, he had imagined this day as one of pride, joy, and celebration. His son, Ryan, was getting married. It should have been simple. It should have been beautiful. Yet a strange tightness pulled at Greg's chest, something he couldn't name. He lifted the father of the groom speech from the dresser, smoothing its crisp edges before sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The words he'd written were heartfelt, maybe more vulnerable than anything he had said aloud to his son in years. He hoped, foolishly perhaps, that today would open a door between them, a chance to bridge the distance that had grown quietly, steadily, until it felt almost permanent. When he arrived at the Manhattan wedding venue, an upscale space shimmering under glass chandeliers and polished marble floors, Greg paused to take it all in. Guests in elegant attire floated inside, laughter echoing softly. The air smelled faintly of fresh orchids, and a string quartet performed near the entrance, their music lending the evening a sense of refinement. It was the kind of venue that announced success, achievement, wealth. A place Greg knew well, because he had spent years striving to give his children every advantage he never had. He spotted Samantha near the reception desk, her navy dress glowing under the warm lighting. She smiled when she saw him, brushing a stray thread from his lapel. "You look handsome," she said gently. "Ryan will be glad you made the effort." "I'd never miss this day," Greg replied, though her wording pricked him. "Made the effort," as if showing up for his son's wedding was optional. Samantha hesitated before saying, "He's with the groomsmen. He's a little distant today." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Greg already knew what she meant. Inside the ceremony hall, rows of white chairs lined a candle-lit aisle. Towering floral arrangements framed the altar where Ryan and Grace would soon exchange vows. Greg felt a surge of pride when he finally spotted his son across the room. Ryan looked sharp, confident, dressed in a fitted black suit that made him appear older, more polished. He was laughing with friends, completely absorbed in their conversation. Greg approached with quiet hopefulness. "You look great, Ryan." Ryan turned, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Dad." No hug, no handshake, just two words delivered with the kind of emotional distance Greg had grown used to but never fully understood. "I'm proud of you," Greg continued, forcing warmth into his tone. "Really proud." "Yeah," Ryan said. "Thanks." He looked past Greg, scanning the room as though already searching for an escape. Before Greg could attempt another word, the wedding planner swooped in, ushering Ryan away for photos. Greg stepped aside, his disappointment tucked beneath a polite smile. The ceremony itself was beautiful, almost cinematic. Grace glided down the aisle in a gown that shimmered like liquid silver, her smile radiant. Ryan's face softened when he saw her, blooming into an expression of affection Greg had rarely witnessed. Their vows were tender, emotional, personal in a way children rarely shared with their parents. When Ryan spoke about finding someone who truly understood him, Greg felt the words lodge deep, like a quiet accusation wrapped inside a sentimental moment. After the ceremony, the reception hall buzzed with excitement. Champagne flowed freely. Laughter rose in waves. Greg waited patiently, watching for a moment when his son drifted away from the crowd. Eventually, he saw Ryan standing near the bar, adjusting his wedding band while checking his phone. Greg approached cautiously. "Hey," he said, "got a minute? I was hoping we could talk, just us." Ryan didn't look up. "Dad, it's my wedding. I don't have time for this." "This won't take long," Greg replied gently. "I just wanted to say." Ryan cut him off with a sharp exhale, turning to face him fully. "Why do you always do this? Why do you make everything about you?" The words hit Greg like a jolt. Conversations nearby softened as people instinctively tuned in. "I'm not," Greg began. "You never supported me," Ryan said, louder now. "You showed up only when it made you look good. You weren't a father, just a wallet, and honestly, I don't want you here." A hush rippled through the crowd. Samantha froze. Emma stared in disbelief. Greg swallowed, the burning humiliation rising in his throat. "If that's how you feel," he said quietly, "I'll go." He straightened his jacket, walked out of the venue without looking back, and stepped into the cool Manhattan night. Sitting alone in his car, he replayed Ryan's words again and again, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. For the first time in his life, Greg genuinely wondered if he had already lost his son long before tonight. The morning light filtering through the kitchen windows had a softness to it, the kind of gentle glow that usually signaled calm, quiet beginnings. But nothing felt calm to Greg. He sat at the breakfast table with a mug of untouched coffee, his mind replaying the moment from the night before, Ryan's voice rising over the music, the eyes of strangers watching, the heat of humiliation burning under his skin. He had barely slept. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw his son's face harden, heard the sentence that had hollowed him out. "I don't want you here." The phone buzzed on the table. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Greg glanced at the screen, expecting maybe a message from Samantha or Emma checking on him. It was Ryan. For a moment Greg considered letting it ring. His stomach tightened. Still, he answered, "Ryan." His son's voice came sharp, cold, businesslike, nothing like the heated emotions from the wedding, yet somehow worse. "Dad, I need you to bring me the property papers." Greg blinked. "The what?" "The estate papers. The house, the land, everything under your name. Just send them to me. Today." The bluntness stripped the breath from Greg's lungs. "Ryan, it's barely morning. After everything last night, you're calling about property." "I don't want to argue," Ryan said. "Just get the papers. I need them." Then he hung up. No explanation, no apology, nothing. Greg stared at the phone, feeling an emptiness spread through him like a slow-moving flood. The wedding confrontation had already cut deep, but this demand, felt calculated, intentional, like the opening shot of a battle he wasn't prepared for. A moment later, he heard footsteps. Samantha entered the kitchen, tying her robe tighter around her. She studied Greg's face and knew immediately something was wrong. Who was that? "Ryan," the word tasted bitter. "He wants the property papers." Samantha froze. "This morning, after last night." "He didn't even mention the wedding," Greg said, rubbing his forehead. "Just straight to business, as if I'm a clerk he can order around." Samantha sat across from him. "You need to talk to him, Greg. There has to be something else going on. No son calls the morning after his wedding asking for property documents unless someone is pushing him." "Talk to him?" Greg let out a humorless laugh. "Sam, he threw me out of his wedding, in front of everyone." Samantha exhaled slowly. "I know, and it was wrong, but this family won't survive if both of you keep holding on to anger." Greg didn't respond. He stared at the steam rising from his coffee, his mind drifting decades back, Ryan as a child, smiling through missing teeth, running to him with scraped knees. Ryan as a teenager, sullen and distant, the arguments, the silences, the quiet moments that felt rare even when they were happening. Somewhere along the line, something had shifted. Maybe Greg had been too focused on work. Maybe Ryan had been too sensitive. Maybe both had failed each other in ways they didn't understand. The phone rang again. This time it was Emma. Greg answered, "Hey, sweetheart." Her tone carried hesitation. "Dad, I heard what happened at the wedding. Are you okay?" "No," he admitted quietly, "not really." "I figured," Emma sighed. "I'm calling because Ryan mentioned something to me a few weeks ago. He's been talking a lot about the estate, about inheritance, about wanting control." Greg tensed. Control. "It didn't sound like it was coming from him," Emma continued. "More like someone was influencing him. Maybe Grace. Maybe her family. Dad, just be careful. He's not thinking about family right now. He's thinking about leverage." Greg's chest tightened again, this time with something closer to dread. Financial control, legal maneuvering. None of it felt accidental anymore. After Emma hung up, Greg sat in the quiet kitchen, Samantha watching him with growing concern. He wanted to dismiss it all, to say Ryan was just overwhelmed or stressed or confused after the wedding. But deep inside, something darker twisted, a fear that his son's call wasn't a moment of impulse but a step in a deliberate plan. Samantha touched his hand. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I don't know my own son anymore," Greg said, his voice low. "And that scares me." Samantha squeezed his fingers. "Don't make any decisions while you're emotional." Greg pulled his hand back gently. He stood from the table, pacing slowly, each step echoing the turmoil churning beneath his composed exterior. "He wants the property papers," he said. "Why now? Why like this?" "I don't know," Samantha whispered. "But please don't react out of anger, just talk to him." Greg stopped by the window, staring out at the quiet suburban street. The morning looked peaceful, but inside him everything felt unsteady, shifting like ground about to split open. Finally, he turned to Samantha. "I need time," he said. "Time to figure out what this means, and how I'm supposed to handle our own son demanding my estate like I owe it to him." Samantha watched him carefully, fear flickering behind her eyes. And though neither of them said it aloud, both felt it. Something had started. Something they weren't sure they could stop. Greg sat in his study, the curtains drawn halfway, letting only a muted wash of morning light spill across the shelves. The leather chair creaked beneath him as he leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Ryan's demand for the property papers kept circling his thoughts like a storm refusing to break. He needed clarity, someone who understood the stakes, the legal implications, and the hidden motivations behind a request like this. So he called Harrison Blake. Harrison, his longtime business partner, arrived that afternoon. He stepped into the study with the same confident stride he always carried. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, a man who knew how to negotiate risk and power with ease. "Tell me everything," Harrison said as he set his briefcase down. Greg recounted the wedding humiliation, the morning phone call, Emma's warning, and the strange urgency in Ryan's voice. When he finished, Harrison leaned back, hands clasped over his stomach, his expression unreadable. "Greg," he said finally, "your son isn't asking, he's positioning." Greg frowned. Positioning for what? He's already married, already building his own life. Why go after mine? "Because people get bold when they think they're owed something," Harrison replied. "And because he has leverage now, a partner who works in law who might be feeding him ideas. You need to assert control before he takes this into a courtroom." The word courtroom tightened Greg's chest. He wouldn't go that far. Harrison tilted his head. "Wouldn't he? He kicked you out of his wedding, Greg, in front of 200 people. Pride doesn't make someone do that. Pressure does." Greg felt a slow burn rising inside him. Shame mixed with anger, the memory of whispers and stares from the night before sharp as broken glass. He had trusted Ryan, invested in him, sacrificed for him. And now his own son was circling him like an opponent. As if on cue, Greg's phone buzzed. Ryan again. He let it ring, breathing through the frustration clawing at him. Harrison nodded toward the device. "Answer it." I don't want to, Greg muttered. That's your pride talking, Harrison said, and pride is how people like Ryan win. Reluctantly, Greg picked up the phone. Ryan. I've been waiting, Ryan snapped. His tone carried a new edge, impatient, self-assured, almost rehearsed. Did you find the papers yet? No, and I'm not just handing them over without a real conversation. There's nothing to talk about, Ryan said. I'm your son. This is supposed to come to me anyway. Greg's jaw tightened. Entitlement. He heard it clearly now, threaded through every word. What you're asking isn't simple inheritance. This estate is my livelihood, my history. You don't just demand it like a package waiting on a doorstep. Ryan scoffed. Dad, stop being dramatic. You've had control long enough. It's my turn. Greg's free hand curled into a fist. Your turn. That's how you see this. It's how it is, Ryan said flatly. You raised me to be ambitious. Don't get upset now that I am. Then the line went dead. Greg lowered the phone slowly, the silence in the study thickening. Harrison watched him carefully. This isn't about property anymore, Harrison said. This is about dominance. About Ryan proving something to you, to himself, maybe even to that fiancée of his. Outside the study, the house felt heavier than usual. Samantha moved quietly through the hallway, listening without trying to. When Greg stepped out, she met him with worried eyes. What did he say? What he always says lately, Greg replied tiredly. That I'm in his way. Samantha touched his arm. Greg, he's your son. He's overwhelmed, newly married, influenced by someone who probably doesn't understand your family's history. Try to see beyond the anger. I can't, Greg said, pulling his arm away gently but firmly. Not after last night, not after this morning. He's not confused, Sam. He's demanding something he thinks he deserves simply because he's my son. Maybe he feels ignored, Samantha suggested softly. Maybe this is his way of trying to take control of his life. By taking mine, Greg shot back. The bitterness surprised even him. She sighed, defeated. Just don't let this break the family. But the cracks were already spreading. By evening, Ryan sent 2 more messages, short, irritated, increasingly hostile. Each one demanded the documents. Today. Now. Stop delaying. The tone no longer sounded like a request from a son. It sounded like an ultimatum from someone who believed he had every right to strip Greg of the life he'd built. Greg stood in the doorway of his study, staring at the old file cabinet that held the estate paperwork. A strange chill moved through him as he realized something he hadn't been willing to acknowledge before. This wasn't a disagreement. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even about inheritance. Ryan was preparing for something larger, something calculated, something that might already be in motion. And Greg, for the first time, understood he wasn't dealing with his son. He was dealing with an opponent. Greg had barely slept for 2 nights, his mind pacing the same circular hallway of confusion, anger, and disbelief. Ryan's demands were bad enough, but the urgency behind them hinted at something deeper, something more deliberate. He tried to push the thought aside, but suspicion kept chipping away at him like water wearing down stone. That suspicion solidified into something far heavier when Harrison called early that morning. Greg, Harrison said, his tone tight, I did some digging like you asked. You're not going to like this. Greg's grip tightened around the phone. What is it? Ryan met with a lawyer last week. Not just any lawyer, Lillian Moore. Greg's heart stopped for a moment. Lillian Moore was a powerhouse, sharp, relentless, a corporate attorney known for handling high-value estate transfers. You didn't meet Lillian Moore unless you intended to move something big, something permanent, something life-altering. Are you sure? Greg asked, his voice shaking before he could hide it. I have confirmation, Harrison replied. He consulted her about transferring property from a living relative. Greg, he's preparing to take your estate. The word struck like a physical blow. Greg lowered himself into a chair, staring at the hardwood floor as if it might offer an explanation. Ryan hadn't just been influenced or confused. He had planned this. He had prepared, and he had done it behind Greg's back. A coldness seeped into his chest. Something in him, something paternal, something hopeful, fractured. "I need to talk to him," Greg said quietly. He didn't wait for Harrison's response. He hung up, grabbed his keys, and drove straight to Ryan's new apartment in Manhattan. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles blanched. Traffic lights blurred past him. His pulse thudded at his temples, his breath coming too fast. When Ryan opened the door, he looked surprised, but not guilty. That made Greg even angrier. "Dad, did you call first?" "No," Greg said, pushing past him into the apartment. "We need to talk now." Ryan closed the door slowly. "Okay, what's going on?" Greg turned to face him, jaw tight. "I know you met with Lillian Moore." Ryan's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Lillian who?" "Don't lie to me, Ryan," Greg snapped. "You consulted her about transferring the estate into your name, a week before the wedding." Ryan stared at him, expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." Greg could feel heat rising under his skin. The denial wasn't defensive, it was calm, practiced, controlled, and that terrified him more than an admission would have. "Why are you doing this?" Greg demanded. "After everything I've given you, everything I've built for this family, you go behind my back and meet with a lawyer. You try to take what isn't yours." Ryan shrugged slightly. "Dad, you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Greg's voice cracked. "You're plotting a legal takeover of my property." Before Ryan could respond, Grace stepped into the living room, her presence cool and composed. She wore a tailored blouse, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes reflecting nothing but polite curiosity. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "No," Greg said, unable to control the bitterness in his tone. Grace offered a calm smile, folding her arms. "Greg, maybe you're misunderstanding something. Ryan has always meant to inherit the estate eventually. It makes sense for him to start preparing, planning ahead." Greg shot her a look. "Planning ahead is one thing. Trying to seize control while I'm still alive is another." Grace's smile didn't waver. "You've had control for decades. Maybe it's time for Ryan to take on more responsibility. He is the rightful future owner after all." The words slammed into Greg like a body blow. Rightful owner. The phrase cut deeper than anything Ryan had said. It wasn't just influence, it was manipulation, calculated, intentional. Ryan didn't contradict her, and that silence was its own confession. Samantha's voice echoed in Greg's memory. "Try to be understanding." But standing here, staring at his son, and the woman who seemed to be pulling strings behind him, understanding felt impossible. Greg stepped back, shaking his head. "Is this what you want, Ryan? To take everything I built by force?" Ryan exhaled sharply. "No one is taking anything by force. You're blowing this out of proportion." "That's not what it looks like." Samantha's voice came from behind them. She had followed Greg after sensing something was wrong. She walked into the room, her eyes darting between father and son. "Please," she said softly, "everyone calm down." But the rift had already widened past the point of calm words. Greg felt something inside him collapse, a mixture of pride, trust, and years of silent effort. His own son had positioned himself as an adversary, and Grace, she wasn't even hiding her stance anymore. He looked at Samantha, then at Ryan. "If you're trying to take this legally," Greg said, voice low, "I won't let it happen." Ryan's face hardened at that, the mask slipping for just a second. Greg turned toward the door, breathing unsteady. He needed space. He needed clarity. He needed a plan before Ryan made another move. But as he stepped into the hallway, one truth hit him with chilling clarity. He was outnumbered. And the real battle hadn't even started yet. Greg sat in his attorney's conference room, a polished glass table stretching between him and the man he'd trusted with his business affairs for nearly 15 years. The room smelled faintly of leather and ink, the shelves lined with thick law books that suddenly felt far too relevant. Across from him, Michael Turner adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents Greg had brought. The estate papers, the property deeds, the trust outlines he'd built over decades. Papers he never imagined would become ammunition in a fight against his own son. "So," Michael said, folding his hands, "your son wants control transferred immediately." "He's demanding it," Greg replied, forcing the word out. "Calling, texting, sending messages through Grace. He won't stop." Michael nodded slowly. "And you believe he's being advised by Lillian Moore?" "I know he is," Greg said, jaw tightening. "Harrison confirmed it." Michael exhaled. "Lillian is aggressive. If she's involved, Ryan isn't just asking, he's preparing." "That's what scares me," Greg murmured. Michael leaned forward. "What do you want to do?" Greg stared at the table, at the reflection of a man who suddenly looked older, more worn. "I don't want a war," he said quietly, "but I'm not handing over everything I've built because my son thinks he's entitled to it." Michael nodded. "Then you stand firm, but understand, if Lillian makes this a legal matter, it won't be easy." Greg swallowed. "I know." When he left the office, his phone buzzed again. And again. Another message from Ryan, short, sharp, demanding, "Send the papers, stop delaying, don't make this harder." Threat disguised as impatience. By the time Greg pulled into his driveway, an unwelcome heaviness clung to his chest. Samantha met him at the door, worry etched into her face. "What did Michael say?" she asked. "That this isn't going away," Greg replied, loosening his tie. "Ryan's pushing harder, and if I resist, Lillian will escalate." Samantha stepped back, folding her arms. "Greg, this tension is consuming everything. Our home feels like a battlefield. Our marriage—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. Greg looked at her, heart sinking. "Say it." She hesitated then. "I feel like I'm being pulled apart between you and our son. I can't live like this much longer." Her voice trembled, not with anger but with something more fragile. Fear, exhaustion, a quiet plea for stability. Greg took a breath. "Sam, I'm not trying to hurt him, but he's trying to take everything from me, from us." Samantha looked away. "He's still our child." "Then why doesn't he act like one?" The frustration slipped out before Greg could soften it. Silence filled the hallway between them, a silence neither of them knew how to break. That evening, Greg sat alone in his study, scrolling through the messages Ryan had sent. Each one was sharper than the last, as if Ryan believed persistence equaled power. A few days ago, Greg would have tried to reason with him, but reason was what Ryan wanted. He wanted control. And Greg was done surrendering ground. He typed a single sentence back. "This conversation will go through my attorney from now on." Less than 2 minutes later, his phone rang. "Ryan." Greg didn't answer. Another call, then another. Then a final text. "If this is how you want to play it, fine. Lillian will handle everything from here." Shortly after, Michael emailed him. "Lillian Moore has reached out. She wants to schedule a discussion regarding asset transition." Greg's stomach twisted. There it was, the first official move, the opening shot of a legal siege. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He wasn't ready for this. Emotionally, financially, spiritually, he was tired. But surrendering would mean letting Ryan and Grace dismantle the life he'd built brick by brick. A soft knock sounded at the doorway. "Grace." She stepped inside the study, her posture gentle, her smile carefully measured. "Greg, can we talk?" He stiffened. "About what?" "About Ryan," she said softly, approaching the desk. "He's under a lot of pressure. He feels like you don't trust him. Maybe if you just gave him what he's asking for, things would calm down." Greg stared at her. "Calm down for who?" Grace paused. "For all of us." Her voice was soothing, almost persuasive. But beneath that calm exterior, Greg sensed something calculated, a quiet push, a subtle nudge toward surrender. "No," Greg said finally, "I'm not handing over my estate." Grace's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of disappointment, or was it irritation? "Well," she said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." She left the room without another word. Greg turned back to the documents spread across his desk. The weight of the coming battle pressed down on him, heavy, suffocating. He wasn't just fighting for property now. He was fighting for his dignity, his legacy, his place in a family that was tearing itself apart. And as he stared at the estate papers, he realized something unsettling. The fight was only beginning, and he already felt tired. The house felt heavier than usual that morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Greg stood by the kitchen window, watching a pair of finches flutter on the backyard fence, little bursts of life he couldn't feel in himself anymore. His coffee sat untouched on the counter. Sleep had become a stranger, rest, an old memory. He heard a car pulling up the driveway, not Ryan's sharp, impatient engine. This one was softer, familiar. Moments later, the door opened and Emma stepped inside. "Dad," she called out gently. Greg turned, surprised but grateful. "Emma, what are you doing here?" She walked toward him, her expression warm but lined with worry. "I figured you might need someone today." Her eyes scanned the tension-laden room. "It feels different in here, heavy." Greg tried to force a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything feels heavy." Emma placed a hand on his arm. "Tell me what's going on." And so he did. He told her about Ryan's demands, about the pressure, about Grace's visit, about the legal storm forming on the horizon. He tried not to let his voice shake, but the exhaustion slipped through his words like cracks in plaster. Emma listened quietly, her brows knitting together. "Dad, this isn't normal behavior. Ryan's not thinking clearly. And Grace, she's pushing him in ways that aren't healthy." Greg exhaled hard. "I don't recognize him anymore. It's like he's become someone else." "Maybe it's pressure," Emma said, "or insecurity, or maybe he thinks he has something to prove." Greg pinched the bridge of his nose. "Prove what? That he can take everything from me." Emma hesitated. "Dad, have you considered talking to a mediator, or bringing in a family counselor, something before this turns into a war?" Greg shook his head. "It's already a war. You can still stop it from getting worse." He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of tires crunching on gravel cut him off. A second car was pulling in fast, too fast. Emma walked to the window and stiffened. "It's Ryan." A knot formed in Greg's chest. Seconds later, the front door flew open, and Ryan marched inside with Grace right behind him. His face was tight, jaw set, eyes burning with a mix of anger and entitlement. "We need to talk," Ryan said, not bothering with greetings. Greg stepped forward. "Ryan, this isn't a good time." Ryan ignored him. "Where are the papers?" Greg stared at him. "I told you we're handling this legally. I'm not handing over anything." Ryan scoffed. "Legally, you'd really drag your own son into court." "You're the one pushing me there," Greg snapped. Grace stepped in, placing a hand on Ryan's arm. "Greg, no one wants a legal fight. If you just cooperate, this can end today." Emma's eyes narrowed. "Grace, you're not helping." Grace smiled politely, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "I'm simply advocating for what's fair." Greg turned to Ryan. "What's fair is respecting your father, not demanding he surrender his life's work like it's some overdue bill." Ryan's voice rose. "Dad, stop acting like this is just about you. You've held control over everything for decades. I'm not a kid anymore. I deserve a share." "A share isn't the whole thing," Greg shot back. "And you're demanding everything." Ryan stepped closer, practically shaking with frustration. "Because you won't listen. If you cared about family, you'd hand it over instead of clinging to power." "Power?" Greg blinked, stunned. This isn't about power, this is about trust, and you've broken it. Ryan's jaw tightened. Then we're done talking. No, Greg said firmly. You showed up at my home, you're going to listen. For a moment the room filled with something raw, hurt layered under anger, history tangled with betrayal. Father and son stood inches apart, both convinced they were the one being wronged. Grace stepped in again. Ryan, let's go, this isn't productive. Ryan didn't move. His eyes locked on Greg's like he was trying to stare him into surrender. Last chance, Dad, the papers. Greg felt something inside him fracture. Not break completely, just crack enough to let the grief seep through. No, he said softly, I'm not giving them to you. Ryan let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. Fine, then don't blame me for what happens next. He turned sharply and stormed out, Grace following with a tight-lipped expression that said everything Greg feared. She wanted this fight. The door slammed behind them. Silence settled over the house, thick and suffocating. Emma placed a hand on Greg's back. Dad, are you okay? Greg didn't answer. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the emotional weight crushing down on him. He felt drained, exhausted to the bone. But as he inhaled slowly, a small spark of resolve flickered inside him. No, he whispered, but I won't give in, not like this. The storm had arrived on his doorstep. And the next move, he knew, would decide everything. Days following Ryan's explosive visit blurred together in a mix of restless nights and tense mornings. Greg moved through the house like a shadow of himself, replaying every word, every moment, every decision that had led them here. A father shouldn't have to wonder how his son became an adversary. A family shouldn't feel like a battlefield. But that was what his home had become. Silent hallways, cold meals, and conversations so brittle they threatened to shatter. Greg sat at his desk, staring at the estate documents spread before him. His hands rested on the pages, but he didn't feel connected to them anymore. They were symbols of legacy, of effort, of sacrifice, but also of conflict. He wasn't sure how much more he could hold on without losing something far more important. He called Harrison. Talk to me, Harrison said the moment he answered. You sound worn down. I'm tired, Greg admitted. Tired of fighting, tired of feeling like I'm the villain in my own family. Harrison sighed. Greg, listen, you're caught between pride and fear, and both are understandable, but right now you need clarity, not emotion. That's easy for you to say. No, Harrison said, it's not. I've seen what legal fights do to families. If you push this into a full-scale battle, someone will lose more than money. Greg leaned back in his chair. So what are you saying? Give him what he wants. I'm saying consider why he wants it, Harrison replied. Anger is often a mask for something deeper. Resentment, insecurity, hurt. You don't have to surrender, but you might need to understand the wound behind the demand. Greg closed his eyes. He didn't want to understand the wound. He wanted the wounds Ryan caused to stop bleeding. Still, Harrison's words stuck with him long after the call ended. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Greg opened it to find Grace standing on the porch, holding a leather handbag and wearing an expression designed to look gentle. Greg, she said softly, can we talk? He stiffened. Grace had become a symbol of everything that was wrong: control, influence, manipulation. But something in her eyes today was different. Make it quick, Greg said, stepping aside. She walked into the living room, placing her bag down. I know things have escalated too fast, she began, and I don't want a legal war. Neither does Ryan, even if he acts like he does. Greg folded his arms. You're pushing him. Grace shook her head. I'm trying to support him. He feels overshadowed. He feels like he's never had a say in his own family. Greg's jaw tightened. So taking everything I built is how he finds his voice. I'm not defending his approach, Grace replied, but I'm offering you a chance to resolve this peacefully. Sit down with him, talk, without lawyers, without threats. Greg hesitated. Pain flickered inside him, but so did a quiet longing. He wanted his son back, not this version shaped by resentment and legal strategy. "I'll think about it," he said. Grace nodded, accepting the small concession. "That's all I wanted." After she left, Greg stood in the doorway for a long time, wondering if he had misjudged her, or if she was simply better at persuasion than he realized. It was Emma who pushed him forward. "Dad," she said that evening as she helped prepare dinner, "you're fighting so hard to protect the estate that you're forgetting what's at stake emotionally." Greg looked at her weary. "And what's that?" "Our family," she said simply. "Ryan is wrong completely, but you're both hurting each other, and if this continues, you won't have a relationship left to salvage." Her words cut deeper than she knew. That night, Samantha arranged a family dinner, her attempt at normalcy or maybe diplomacy. The table was set, candles lit, plates warm. Greg sat at the head of the table, Emma beside him. When Ryan and Grace arrived, tension followed them like a second shadow. Dinner began with shallow conversation, safe topics, forced smiles, clinking silverware. But beneath the surface, the air buzzed with unsaid words. Ryan barely met Greg's eyes. Grace watched every moment like a strategist. Samantha kept smoothing her napkin, pretending not to notice the cracks widening around her. Emma tried to bridge the silence, but even her voice trembled. When Greg finally spoke, the table fell still. "Ryan," he said quietly, "this fight is tearing us apart." Ryan's jaw clenched. "Then end it, give me the papers." Greg shook his head. "It's not that simple. This isn't just property, it's our history, it's my life's work." Ryan looked away, frustration tightening his features. "And I'm trying to build my own life." Emma stepped in gently. "Maybe you both need to listen instead of fight." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, thick with hurt, pride, and longing. As the dinner ended, Greg realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. This conflict couldn't be solved with force. Not with lawyers. Not with threats. If he wanted his family back, he would need something far more difficult. Reconciliation. And that, he feared, might be the hardest battle of all. The shift in Ryan didn't happen overnight, but Greg felt it like a slow tightening around his ribs, subtle at first, then suffocating. Ever since the tense family dinner, Ryan's tone in their conversations had changed. What used to be irritation had sharpened into something colder, more entitled, as if he had rehearsed his new persona and decided it fit him better than the old one. They met at a cafe that following afternoon, after Ryan insisted they talk in a neutral place. Greg went reluctantly, hoping the setting might soften things. It didn't. Ryan sat with his arms crossed, shoulders squared, the posture of a man who arrived already convinced he was right. "Dad," he began, not bothering with pleasantries, "let's be honest. The estate should pass to me. It's the natural order. I'm your son, your heir." Greg blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. "That's not how things work, not while I'm alive." Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled. "You've held on to control long enough. It's my turn. I'm entitled to it." The word sliced into Greg like a blade. Entitled. Not grateful, not hopeful, not curious. Entitled. Before he could respond, Grace slid into the seat beside Ryan. She must have arrived after him, watching from a distance, waiting for her cue. Her smile was gentle, polished, the kind that concealed more than it revealed. "Greg," she said, lightly touching Ryan's arm, "this isn't an attack. Ryan just wants stability. You've built an incredible life and he wants to continue that legacy." Greg met her eyes. "Legacy isn't a baton you snatch out of someone's hand." Grace softened her tone further. "No one's snatching anything. We're trying to avoid conflict, not create it." But the gentle phrasing barely masked the pressure beneath it. Greg could feel it. An invisible tug-of-war, Grace pulling Ryan forward, Greg trying to hold onto what remained of their relationship. Ryan cleared his throat. "Dad, if you do this willingly, we avoid legal mess. Everyone wins." Everyone, Greg thought, except me. On the drive home, Greg's mind raced. Giving up the papers would end the tension, the arguments, the constant attacks. Maybe surrender meant peace. Maybe losing the estate was better than losing his son entirely. The possibility frightened him more than he wanted to admit. That evening, Samantha found him in the living room staring at the empty fireplace. She sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You're thinking about giving in," she said softly. Greg didn't answer. Samantha sighed. "I see what Grace is doing to him. She's shaping his decisions, feeding him these ideas, and he's letting her." "She's not the only problem," Greg said, rubbing his eyes. "He believes he deserves everything." "Because she's telling him he does," Samantha replied. "Greg, if you give up the estate because you're scared of losing him, you'll only teach him that manipulation works." Greg swallowed hard. "So what am I supposed to do? Keep fighting until we destroy each other?" Samantha looked at him with tired eyes. "I don't know, but giving them everything won't fix the damage. They'll just take more." Before Greg could respond, Emma walked in, overhearing just enough to raise her voice. "Dad, this has to stop." Greg turned. "Emma." "No," she cut in, stepping forward. "I'm sick of watching this tear us apart. Ryan is acting like a stranger, and you're letting him drag you into his chaos. We are falling apart, and nobody is doing anything to stop it." Her voice cracked, anger and grief tangled in her expression. Greg stood, trying to calm her. "I'm doing everything I can." Emma shook her head. "No, you're reacting, you're not choosing, and meanwhile this family is burning down." Her words left a mark. She stormed upstairs, leaving Greg standing in the quiet aftermath of her frustration. The next day, things escalated again, publicly. Greg was at the country club, meeting a business contact, when Ryan appeared at the front entrance, striding toward him with the confidence of someone ready to make a scene. Greg felt his stomach drop. "Dad," Ryan said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "we need to settle this now." Greg froze. "Ryan, not here." Ryan ignored him. "If you don't hand over the estate papers, I'll pursue legal action. I'm done waiting." Several heads turned. Conversations paused. Greg felt humiliation prick the back of his neck. "Ryan," he whispered, "please stop." But Ryan continued, voice unwavering. Grace appeared behind him seconds later, arms folded, as if she were observing a performance she had helped script. Greg stared at his son, his boy who used to reach for his hand, who used to run to him after school, who used to believe Greg could fix anything. That boy was gone, replaced by someone who saw him not as a father but as an obstacle. Greg felt something inside him crumble. This wasn't about money, or property, or inheritance. It was about losing his son piece by piece. And now, standing in the middle of a room full of witnesses, Greg realized he was losing the fight he had never wanted in the first place. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, slid through the mail slot with a soft thud that echoed far louder in Greg's mind than any knock could have. He noticed the return address instantly, Moore and Associates, Manhattan. His stomach tightened. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Still, his hands trembled as he tore the seal. Legal notice. Formal demand for transfer of property holdings. Ryan's name was printed beneath Lillian Moore's signature. For a moment the world around Greg blurred. The kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the half-finished cup of coffee, all of it faded. All he could hear was the faint ringing in his ears, the cold sentence forming in his mind. "My own son has officially declared war on me." He sat down slowly, lowering himself into the nearest chair before his legs gave out. The paper shook in his hands. He read every line, even though each one cut deeper than the last. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a threat. It was a formal step toward stripping him of everything he had built. Samantha found him minutes later, pale and unmoving. "What's that?" she asked, voice soft but tense. Greg handed her the letter silently. Her eyes widened as she read. He actually filed a demand. "Greg, this is serious." He couldn't speak. The betrayal was too raw, too immediate. He'd always feared the relationship was damaged, but he never believed his son would force his hand like this. Samantha placed a hand on his shoulder. "You need to talk to Michael." Greg nodded stiffly. He didn't want to, he didn't want any of this, but the decision had been made for him. Within an hour, Greg sat across from his attorney again, the office colder this time, or maybe it was just him. Michael took the letter, scanned it carefully, and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Well," he said, "this confirms it. Ryan's preparing to take you to court." Greg swallowed. "What do we do?" "We defend," Michael replied. "You have legal standing. The estate is yours, but this won't be pleasant. Lillian is known for pushing cases hard and fast. She's not trying to negotiate, she's aiming to break your resolve." Greg lowered his head, rubbing his temples. "Why would my own son do this?" "That's not a legal question," Michael said gently, "but it's one you'll need to face." The meeting dragged on, filled with discussions about responses, documentation, timelines. Words like counterclaim, injunctive relief, and asset protection swirled around Greg, but none of them soothed the growing ache in his chest. When he finally returned home, the emotional toll was visible. His shoulders drooped. His eyes looked hollow. He moved like a man twice his age. Samantha met him in the hallway. "Greg, please. Whatever's happening, you can still make peace with him. He's angry, confused." "He's suing me," Greg interrupted, voice breaking. "How do you make peace with that?" Samantha's eyes softened painfully. "He's still your son." "That's what scares me," Greg whispered, "because it means this hurts more than anything else ever could." She reached for his hand, but he stepped back, overwhelmed. He needed air. He needed answers. He needed to look his son in the eyes and ask him how things had fallen so far. So Greg drove to Ryan's apartment that evening. He didn't call first. He didn't knock gently. He knocked like a father who had been pushed to his absolute limit. Ryan opened the door, surprise flickering briefly across his face before annoyance replaced it. "Dad, why are you?" Greg stepped inside without waiting. "We're talking now." Ryan shut the door with a sigh. "If this is about the letter." "Of course it's about the letter," Greg snapped. "You didn't call, you didn't explain, you sent a lawyer after me." Ryan folded his arms. "It's business, Dad, don't make it emotional." "How can it not be emotional?" Greg demanded. "You're my son, and you're trying to take everything I've spent my life building." Ryan's jaw hardened. "You act like I'm stealing something. It's mine. Eventually, yes, but mine. You've controlled everything for so long, money, decisions, the family. I'm done waiting for you to step aside." Greg felt his breath catch. "You think this is about control? This is about family, about trust, about loyalty." "It's about what I deserve," Ryan said coldly. Greg stared at him, shocked. "Deserve? You didn't build any of this." "I shouldn't have to," Ryan replied. "I'm your son, that's enough." The entitlement in his voice, so clear, so unashamed, hit Greg with the force of a revelation. His son didn't just want the estate. He believed he was owed it. He believed Greg's life's work existed for him to inherit, regardless of effort, sacrifice, or respect. Greg's anger drained, replaced by something heavier, grief. "I came here," Greg said quietly, "hoping you'd understand what this is doing to our family. What it's doing to me." Ryan didn't flinch. "Dad, this isn't personal." "It's personal to me," Greg said softly, "because I'm realizing this fight isn't about money anymore." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it?" Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's about proving that I mattered as a father, and right now, I don't think I did." For the first time, Ryan looked away, not in guilt but in impatience. "We're done here," he said. Greg walked out slowly, each step heavier than the last. Because now he understood the truth. He wasn't just defending his estate. He was defending the last remaining proof that he had ever meant something to his son. Greg had thought the legal letter was the worst of it, the breaking point after months of tension. But the real breaking point came quietly, almost accidentally. It came on a Tuesday morning when he logged into one of the family financial accounts, something he rarely checked himself anymore. His accountant usually handled the routine monitoring, but Michael had suggested keeping a closer eye on things in case Ryan tries anything premature. So Greg opened the portal. At first, everything looked normal, balances intact, statements filed. But then his eyes caught an alert he didn't recognize, pending transfer request. He clicked it. His breath stopped. The request listed Ryan's name. The amount wasn't small. It was one of the sub-accounts Greg had set aside years ago for emergency family expenses, quiet, private, known to only a few people. And there, next to the pending approval, was a digital trail of previous attempts. Multiple, system flagged, blocked due to missing signatures. Ryan had tried before the wedding, before the confrontation, before the legal demand. The realization hit Greg like a truck. Ryan hadn't begun this war out of recent anger. He had been planning, calculating, long before Greg even knew they were on opposite sides. His pulse pounded in his ears. He clicked deeper into the account history. More alerts, more attempted changes. Ryan had tried to alter beneficiary designations. He had accessed shared accounts. He had even attempted to initiate a title review on the estate property. All behind Greg's back. A cold wave washed through him. Everything he thought he understood about his son twisted into something unrecognizable. This wasn't influence. This wasn't confusion. This was intention. He printed the documents with shaking hands, drove straight to Manhattan, and asked the doorman which unit Grace Parker was currently home in. She answered her door with a too-perfect smile, her posture relaxed, as if she had expected this visit eventually. "Greg," she said warmly, though her eyes flickered with guarded calculation, "this is a surprise." "We're talking," Greg said, stepping inside before she had the chance to decline. Grace closed the door slowly. "All right, what's going on?" He handed her the printed documents. She looked at them briefly, her expression barely shifting. "You knew," Greg said, voice tight. "You knew he was doing this." Grace exhaled through her nose, crossed her arms. "Ryan told me he was exploring options, looking into what would be his someday anyway." "He tried to transfer funds," Greg snapped. "He tried to change accounts that aren't his, and you let him." "I didn't let anything," Grace replied coolly. "I supported him. There's a difference." Greg stared at her, astonished by the boldness of her deflection. "Supported him. You're advising him, guiding him into decisions he doesn't understand the consequences of." Grace tilted her head. "Greg, with all due respect, Ryan is an adult. You can't blame me because he's finally asserting himself." "Assertive," Greg stepped forward. "He's crossing legal lines. He's tearing this family apart." "And you're holding on to control like it's oxygen," Grace countered. "Maybe if you trusted him, trusted us, none of this would be happening." Greg felt his jaw tighten. "You're twisting this." "I'm being practical," she said, unmoved. "Something you've always struggled with when it comes to your children." Her words stung, not because they were true, but because she said them without hesitation, like she had practiced, like she had analyzed him long before stepping into this family. Greg turned away from her, breathing hard. He had come hoping to understand her role. Instead, she'd confirmed something far worse. She wasn't the voice of reason she preached. And dead to be. She was the architect of the storm circling him. When Greg left the apartment, he didn't drive home. He simply sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, unable to steady his thoughts. Every memory of Ryan, young, hopeful, smiling, clashed violently with the man he'd become. and Greg couldn't decide which version of his son was real anymore. As the days passed, Ryan's behavior grew more erratic. Phone calls full of pressure, messages phrased like ultimatums, reports from mutual acquaintances that Ryan had snapped at colleagues, argued with friends, alienated people who once admired him. The legal pressure was revealing cracks in Ryan's composure, cracks Greg had never noticed before. And with every new escalation, Greg felt something inside him sink deeper into despair. He was losing his son, and losing his legacy, and he couldn't figure out how to stop either from slipping away. One night, after pacing the study for hours, Greg finally sat down at his desk. He looked at the estate documents spread out before him, the history of his life's work, the blueprint of everything he had built from nothing. He touched the papers gently, almost reverently. Then a new feeling settled inside him. Not anger, not grief. Resolve. If he wants a fight, Greg whispered to himself, he'll get one. Because this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reclaiming control, reclaiming dignity, reclaiming himself. Whatever the cost. Greg had reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. Days had passed since he discovered Ryan's hidden attempts to seize assets, and every hour that slipped by tightened the pressure around his chest. He felt cornered, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually. He had spent his entire life building the estate, and now he was watching it become the centerpiece of a war he never wanted. The house felt colder. His sleep had become brief, shallow pockets of rest interrupted by the echo of Ryan's accusations. So that morning, before the sun fully broke over the horizon, Greg called his attorney. "Michael," he said, his voice steady but heavy, "file everything we discussed, all of it. I'm done waiting for him to strike." Michael hesitated. "Are you sure, Greg? Once we move forward, there's no reversing the tone of this battle." "There's no tone left to preserve," Greg replied. "I have to protect what's mine." It was the first time he had said the words with absolute certainty, without guilt pulling at him. And yet, beneath the determination, a small, aching part of him wondered if this decision would push Ryan even farther away. That question lingered in his mind as he called Ryan later that afternoon. "We need to talk," Greg said, "face to face at the house." Ryan's silence was long tense. "Fine," he finally answered, "but I'm not backing down." "I didn't expect you to," Greg replied. When Ryan arrived, he didn't come alone. Grace walked beside him, her expression composed, her confidence unnerving. Samantha waited near the doorway, wringing her hands, while Emma stood quietly at the foot of the stairs, a storm of frustration and sadness in her eyes. The moment Ryan stepped into the estate, the air shifted. Old memories clung to the walls, birthday parties, holiday dinners, the sound of children running down the same hallway that now felt like a war zone. Greg faced his son in the living room, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the floor between them. "Thank you for coming," Greg said. Ryan crossed his arms. "Get to the point." Greg swallowed. "I've filed legal defense. I'm protecting the estate." Ryan let out a dry laugh. "Of course you did. You'd rather sue your own son than admit you've been a terrible father." The words hit Greg like a slap. Samantha gasped softly. Emma's eyes widened. Greg steadied himself. "Ryan, I need you to understand why I'm doing this." "No," Ryan said sharply. "You need to understand why I'm doing this. You never showed up emotionally. Not once. You think money makes up for everything. You think providing a house means you were a father. You were. You were a man chasing success while the rest of us tried to figure out where we fit in your life." Greg's throat tightened. He had expected anger, even entitlement, but not this. Not the raw resentment pouring from his son like it had been simmering for decades. "I did my best," Greg said quietly. "Maybe I didn't say the right things. Maybe I didn't show love the way you wanted, but I tried. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed was for this family. Your sacrifice doesn't excuse the damage, Ryan shot back. You were never present, you were just there when it made you look good. Greg felt the words sinking deeper than any legal threat. This was no longer about property. It was about years of misunderstanding, hurt, unspoken need. I'm trying to explain, Greg said, voice cracking slightly. Not defend, explain. Too late for that, Ryan muttered, turning away. Samantha stepped. Ped forward, tears in her eyes. Please, she pleaded, both of you. Stop turning this into a battlefield. You're destroying yourselves. You're destroying us. But neither man looked at her. Their gaze stayed locked, two sides of a relationship fractured beyond simple repair. Then Emma entered the conversation, not quietly this time. She stepped between them, her expression fierce. This is insane, she snapped. All of you. Dad, you're so obsessed with protecting the estate that you're forgetting you might lose your entire family. And Ryan, she turned toward him angrily, you're acting like a stranger. You're so wrapped up in resentment you can't see the damage you're doing. Ryan's jaw clenched, but he didn't look at her. Emma continued, her voice trembling. Do either of you even see what this is doing to Mom, to us? This house used to be a home. Now it's just evidence of anger, greed, fear, none of it worthy of what we once were. Silence fell, thick as fog. Everyone looked at Greg as if waiting for his final word. He took a slow breath. Ryan, he said, softer than before, what we're doing right now, this fight, it might be the last chance to fix what's broken between us. We can walk out of this room as enemies, or we can really try to understand each other. Ryan didn't move, didn't speak. His face hardened again, unreadable. And in that silence, Greg felt a deep, painful truth settling inside him. This confrontation could heal them, or it could sever them forever. He just didn't know which outcome was already in motion. The envelope arrived by certified mail, thick, stamped, and unmistakably official. Greg held it in his hands for a long moment before opening it, his thumb hesitating over the flap as if delaying could rewrite whatever waited inside. When he finally tore it open, the papers unfolded like a sentence being handed down. Court summons. Filed by Ryan Thompson, represented by Lillian Moore and Associates. It wasn't a threat anymore. It wasn't a warning. It was war. Greg lowered himself onto the edge of the couch, the summons trembling in his hands. It felt surreal, like reading about someone else's tragedy. His own son, his flesh and blood, had just dragged him into a courtroom to take what he claimed was rightfully his. He didn't know how long he sat there before Samantha entered the room. She froze the moment she saw the envelope. No, she whispered, covering her mouth. He didn't. Greg handed her the documents. Her eyes scanned the pages, her breath catching. Greg, how did it get this far? I don't know, he said quietly, but it's happening. Later that afternoon, Greg sat across from Michael again. The summons spread out on the desk between them like a battlefield map. Michael's expression darkened as he read through the allegations. He's accusing you of withholding inherited property, Michael said, claiming you mismanaged family assets. Greg, this isn't just a transfer request. This is a full-blown attempt to declare you unfit to manage your own estate. Greg stared at him. Unfit? I built this estate from nothing. I know, Michael said, and that's why we'll fight, but you need to understand Ryan's case is well prepared, too well prepared. Greg frowned. What does that mean? Michael hesitated before pulling out a set of documents. We subpoenaed some early filings. Your son has been modifying paperwork, drafting alternate versions of financial statements, editing older documents to make it look like he's had managerial involvement in the estate for years. Greg's stomach turned. He forged documents. Modified, Michael corrected carefully. But the intent is clear. He's trying to build the narrative that the estate is practically his already. Greg sank back in the chair, cold dread crawling up his spine. Who taught him how to do this? Michael met his eyes, answer already written on his face. Grace. Grace Parker, polished, composed, quietly ruthless, had been coaching Ryan through every step. She wasn't simply advising him. She was constructing the strategy, shaping the argument, weaponizing Ryan's resentment and ambition. Greg felt something inside him crack. My son and the woman he's marrying, they've been plotting this together. Michael nodded. It appears so. Greg closed his eyes, grief washing over him. He had been blindsided, cornered by two people who should have been building a future, not stealing his past. By the time he returned home that evening, the weight of betrayal had settled deep in his bones. He walked through the quiet hallway, past family photos that now felt like false memories. Samantha followed him into the kitchen, worry etched across her face. "Greg," she said softly, "I spoke with Emma. She's worried about you. I'm worried about you." He didn't answer. "Talk to me," she pleaded. Greg finally looked at her, eyes tired, defeated. "Sam, he manipulated documents. He let Grace twist him into someone I don't recognize, and now he's dragging me to court like I'm a stranger. What kind of father produces a son who can do that?" Samantha's expression softened, but her voice carried exhaustion. "Greg, please, don't take all the blame. Ryan made his choices." "No," Greg said, shaking his head. "I failed him somewhere. I must have. How else could he become someone capable of this?" Samantha stepped closer, but her hands trembled slightly. "I don't know how to support you anymore," she whispered. "I'm being torn between my husband and my son, and I feel like no matter what I do, I'm betraying one of you." Her voice broke. Greg reached for her, but she stepped back. Just half a step, barely noticeable, but enough to carve a new wound. "Samantha," he said softly. She wiped her eyes. "I need you to understand something. If this continues, if you two destroy each other in court, this family may never recover." Greg inhaled sharply. "What do you want me to do? Hand him everything? Let him take the estate because he thinks he deserves it?" "No," she said. "I want you to find a path that doesn't end with both of you losing everything." But Greg wasn't sure that path existed anymore. That night he sat alone in his study, staring at the estate documents, papers that once represented pride and legacy but now looked like the spoils of war. His life's work had become ammunition. His son had become the opposing army, and he was no longer sure what winning even meant. But he knew one thing. He couldn't surrender. Not like this. Not to deception. Not to entitlement. Not to manipulation. He would fight, not out of spite but out of necessity. Because this wasn't just about money. It was about honor. It was about truth. It was about holding on to the last fragments of identity he still recognized. Greg folded the summons, placed it on his desk, and whispered to himself, "If he wants a legal battle, he'll get one." The decision to fight back had felt necessary in the moment, an act of self-respect, a reclaiming of dignity. But as the days slid into weeks, Greg began to realize that battles, even justified ones, cast long shadows, and those shadows were stretching over every corner of his life. Samantha grew quieter. She moved through the house with a kind of emotional limp, drained and weary, flinching at every phone call, every email, every mention of lawyers. Her exhaustion wasn't explosive. It was slow and quiet, like a candle burning too long until it was nothing but smoke. One evening, she approached Greg in the living room, her voice soft but trembling. "I don't know how much more of this I can handle," she said. "Every day feels like we're losing more than we're gaining." Greg looked up from the stack of legal documents in front of him. The print blurred for a second. "Sam, I'm doing this to protect what's ours." "Yes." Hook her head. "No, you're doing this to protect what's yours, and it's destroying us." She walked away before he could respond, her footsteps heavy with resignation. Emma tried to bridge the widening gap. She visited often, trying to soften the edges of the conflict before they became sharp enough to cut through the family completely. "Dad," she said one afternoon, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, "have you considered mediation? A neutral third party, someone who can help you two talk instead of this." She gestured toward the mountain of paperwork, the silent tension between everyone in the house. Greg sighed. "Mediation won't work, not now. Ryan has already committed to a legal assault. He made his choice." Emma frowned, frustration simmering beneath her concern. "But have you thought about what your choice is costing us? What it's doing to Mom? What it's doing to you?" Greg didn't answer. The truth was too messy, too sharp to hold. When the court hearings finally began, the atmosphere was nothing short of hostile. The courtroom, heavy with old wood, cold lighting, and rows of strangers, became the stage for every wound the Thompson family had tried to bury. Ryan sat on one side, flanked by Grace and Lillian Moore. His expression was firm, jaw clenched, eyes burning with something darker than ambition. When he glanced at Greg, there was no flicker of recognition, not of childhood memories, not of shared moments, not of love. Only anger. Greg sat opposite him, Michael at his side, a folder of evidence in front of him. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of what was happening pressed down like a mountain. Witnesses were called, statements read. Years of family grievances, spoken and unspoken, rose to the surface. Grace whispered advice into Ryan's ear like a strategist feeding commands to a soldier. Every time Ryan stood to speak, Greg felt his heart drop further. Ryan accused him of emotional neglect, financial control, manipulation. Greg countered with records, receipts, timelines, a lifetime of proof that he had done his best. But the courtroom didn't care about best. It cared about perspectives, narratives, strategy. At one point, Greg caught Samantha's expression from the gallery seats. She looked torn apart, as if every sentence spoken was another thread pulling their family further apart. Her emotional support for Greg had dimmed, not because she didn't care, but because she was drowning in the wreckage between the two most important men in her life. During a recess, she approached Greg quietly. "Please," she whispered, tears in her eyes, "find a way to end this before it ends us." Greg wanted to promise her something, peace, unity, maybe even surrender, but he couldn't. Not with the stakes so high, not with the estate under attack, not with his own son believing he deserved everything Greg had ever built. Instead, he simply said, "I'm trying, Sam. I'm trying to protect what matters." She stepped back. "I don't know if I even know what matters anymore." Her words lingered long after she walked away. As the hearings dragged on, Greg felt himself fraying. The late nights preparing documents, the harsh words exchanged in court, the cold stares from Ryan, they all carved pieces out of him. One night after another draining day in court, Greg sat alone in his study. The house was quiet. Even the air felt still. Papers lay scattered across the desk, but he couldn't focus on them. His mind drifted, circling the same question. Is winning worth losing everything else? He thought about Samantha's breaking voice, Emma's disappointment, the way Ryan glared at him like a stranger. The estate had been his life's work, but was it becoming the thing that would cost him his family? His hands trembled slightly. Greg inhaled, slow and shaky, as the truth pressed against him with suffocating weight. He wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was fighting the cost of being right. And he was no longer sure he could afford it. The courtroom lights were always too bright. Greg noticed it every time he stepped inside, how the glare reflected off polished tables, how it washed out faces, how it made every flaw, every wrinkle, every tremble impossible to hide. Maybe that was why he felt so exposed lately. The legal battle was stripping him down piece by piece, mentally and physically, until he barely recognized the man staring back at him in the bathroom mirror before each hearing. He had lost weight. His eyes were shadowed, his shoulders slumped. Even simple tasks felt heavier. The fight was grinding him down, and yet he couldn't seem to stop pushing forward. Pride, fear, love, desperation, they all tangled inside him until he wasn't sure which one was steering him anymore. Every hearing forced him to relive moments he'd spent decades trying to forget. The years he had worked late and missed Ryan's games, the tension-filled dinners, the silence that grew between them like a thick fog. Now those memories were bay. NG dissected, analyzed, weaponized by attorneys who didn't care about the nuance of fatherhood. They cared about leverage. One evening after court, Samantha found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. She approached gently, as if afraid he might break under her touch. "Greg," she said softly, "this isn't sustainable. You're exhausted. We're exhausted. Maybe it's time to settle this privately. End it before it destroys what little is left." He didn't look up. "I can't just hand everything over, Sam, not after what he's done." She sat beside him. "I'm not saying surrender. I'm saying find a way out that lets us breathe again." Greg shook his head. He won't negotiate. He wants control, full control. Samantha's shoulders sagged. "Then what are we supposed to do? Watch this family fall apart in slow motion?" Her words cut deeper than any accusation in court, but Greg couldn't bring himself to bend. Not yet. The next day, Emma arrived at the house unannounced, her frustration written all over her face. She didn't wait for pleasantries. "Dad, we need to talk." Greg looked up from the stack of documents he was reviewing. "Emma, I'm in the middle of—" "I don't care," she snapped. "This has gone too far." Her voice quivered, not from anger, but from the weight of months spent holding the family together while everyone else pulled it apart. "Mom is falling apart, you're falling apart. Ryan is completely out of control," she continued. "And Grace, she's turning this into a game, a strategy, and you're playing right into it." Greg felt something tighten in his chest. "Emma." "No, listen to me," she insisted. "You're so focused on winning that you don't see what you're losing." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment he had no response, no defense, just silence. In court, the unraveling was even more obvious. As the battle progressed, Grace's influence became impossible to ignore. She whispered into Ryan's ear between testimonies, guided his tone, corrected his posture, crafted his narrative. And Ryan soaked it in, his arrogance growing with every small win, every favorable ruling, every nod of approval from Lillian. He walked into the courtroom like a man already claiming victory. The son Greg once knew, sensitive, uncertain, eager for approval, had been replaced by someone polished, cold, and hungry. And Grace, she watched Greg with a look that landed somewhere between pity and triumph. One afternoon during a recess, Greg stepped outside for air. He leaned against the brick wall, letting the late-day sun warm his face. His thoughts churned loudly, a storm he couldn't quiet. It hit him suddenly, not like a spark, but like a slow, dawning realization. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about the estate. It wasn't even about legal documents. It was about Ryan. About the chasm between them. About years of silence and misunderstandings. About a relationship that had been rotting long before lawyers got involved. Greg had been fighting to protect his legacy, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what legacy actually meant. It wasn't land. It wasn't property. It wasn't wealth. It was family. And his was slipping away. By the time he returned home that evening, he felt the weight of his decisions, a crushing pressure that wrapped around him like a vice. In the quiet of the house, he found Samantha sitting on the sofa, staring at old family photos scattered on the coffee table. The picture at the top was one from years ago, Ryan as a child, perched on Greg's shoulders, both laughing at something long forgotten. Samantha touched the photo lightly. "Do you remember this day?" Greg sat beside her. "Yeah," he whispered. He was terrified of falling. He held onto my hair so tight I thought he'd pull it out. Samantha smiled sadly. "He trusted you completely." A lump formed in Greg's throat. I don't know when that changed. She looked at him, her eyes soft but tired. Maybe it didn't change all at once. Maybe it was little things over time, little hurts, little misunderstandings. He nodded slowly. "This fight," she continued, "isn't just hurting him, it's hurting you too." Greg exhaled shakily. "I know." They sat together in silence, surrounded by the ghosts of their family's happier days. And in that quiet, Greg felt something crack, not in defeat but in self-awareness. Maybe he had been too stubborn, too proud, too afraid of losing control. Maybe the cost of winning wasn't worth the damage anymore. But the fight wasn't over. And tomorrow, the courtroom would demand answers, whether he was ready or not. Greg woke before dawn, though woke wasn't the right word. He had barely slept. His mind had run in circles all night, chasing shadows of what used to be, what he had lost, and what he was still fighting to hold onto. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like absence. The kind of silence that reminded him of everything slipping through his fingers. "RS." He moved to the kitchen and rested both hands on the cold countertop, his reflection faint in the dark window. For months, he had been fighting to protect the estate, convinced that he was shielding his family's future. But somewhere in the grind of paperwork, hearings, and confrontations, the truth had begun to crack through. He had been protecting the property more fiercely than he had protected the people he loved. It hit him sharply, painfully. He had become obsessed, consumed by fear, pride, and the idea that losing control meant losing his worth. But in defending that control, he had pushed everyone away. Especially Samantha. She wasn't angry anymore. She was distant, and the distance hurt more than any courtroom blow. When she entered the kitchen that morning, she didn't greet him with a smile or even a soft word. She simply nodded, poured herself tea, and sat at the table without looking at him. Greg watched her, noticing everything he hadn't before, how her shoulders slumped with quiet exhaustion, how her eyes carried a heaviness that hadn't been there months ago, how she held her mug like it was an anchor keeping her steady. "Samantha," Greg finally said, his voice cracked, "I know things have been hard." She didn't lift her head. Hard isn't the word for it. He swallowed. "I never meant for this to take over our lives." "But it has," she whispered. "You've become someone I barely recognize. Everything, every conversation, every breath, it's all about the lawsuit, the estate, the fight. There's no room left for us." Greg felt the words like stones landing in his chest. "Sam, I'm trying to protect what we built." She finally looked up, eyes tired, sad. "And in doing that, you're losing what we built emotionally. I don't know if I can keep supporting you when I feel like I'm standing alone." The final word lingered in the air, alone, and Greg felt it echo inside him. Later that afternoon, after Samantha left to clear her head, Greg walked through the estate grounds. The trees swayed gently, the same ones he had planted decades ago. The gravel path crunched beneath his steps. Everything around him was familiar, solid, rooted, yet he felt completely untethered. He found himself at the old bench near the pond, the one where he used to sit with Ryan when he was a child. The memories came slowly, painfully. Ryan feeding ducks, Ryan asking him questions about business, Ryan laughing at stories Greg can barely remember now. When had that little boy started slipping away? When had Greg stopped noticing? He sat on the bench and lowered his head. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit the possibility he had avoided for months. Maybe he had failed as a father. Maybe he had already lost Ryan for good. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Michael again. "Greg," the attorney said, "Ryan's team is pushing for a swift resolution. They're applying pressure to force a settlement." Greg exhaled shakily. "Of course they are." I know this is overwhelming, Michael said gently, but don't surrender now. You have a strong case. Hold firm. Hold firm. Keep fighting. Keep pushing. But what if pushing was what had broken everything in the first place? That evening, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Greg decided he needed to see Ryan alone, without lawyers, without grace, without strategy. When Ryan opened the door of his apartment, he looked irritated. "Dad, what now?" Greg didn't step inside. He didn't ask permission. He simply spoke from the doorway, voice low, heavy. "I came to apologize." Ryan blinked, thrown off balance. "For what?" "For not being the father you needed me to be," Greg said. "For thinking providing was enough. For not listening when you were hurting. For assuming I knew what you wanted when I never asked." Ryan's jaw tightened, but his eyes wavered for a moment, just a moment. Greg continued, "I failed in ways I didn't see, and I'm sorry, truly." Ryan folded his arms defensively. "That doesn't change anything you've done, or what's happening now." "I know," Greg said softly, "but you deserve to hear it." Ryan shook his head. "You never understood me. You never tried. You were too busy running your empire to notice you didn't have a relationship with your own son." Greg absorbed the words, each one slicing deeper than the last. "I'm trying now," he whispered. Ryan's expression hardened. "It's too late." The door almost closed, but Greg lifted a hand, not to stop it but to steady himself. "I'll let the lawyers handle the estate," he said. "But you and I hope someday we can handle us." Ryan didn't answer. He shut the door. Greg stood in the hallway for a long moment, his heart heavy, but strangely, something inside him loosening. For the first time, he wasn't fighting to win the estate. He was fighting to find his son again. And that battle, he finally realized, had nothing to do with control, wealth, or legacy. It had everything to do with love. The courthouse hallway was unusually quiet. Morning, its silence broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps on polished tile. Greg stood near a window, staring out at the city as if the skyline might offer answers. His attorney, Michael, approached with a thick envelope in hand, and a look that warned Greg he wasn't going to like what was inside. "Greg," Michael said carefully, "Ryan's lawyer has presented a settlement offer." Greg didn't turn. He simply closed his eyes, bracing himself. "What kind of offer?" Michael handed him the envelope. Greg opened it slowly, too slowly, and read the first page. His breath caught. Ryan was asking for the majority of the estate. Not half. Not shared control. Practically everything. In exchange, he would drop the lawsuit and end the legal war. Greg stared at the offer, stunned. The very thing he had been fighting to protect, the estate he built, the assets that represented decades of sacrifice, was being laid before him as a choice. Surrender it or continue burning the remains of his family in court. "Michael," Greg whispered, "this would wipe me out." "It would," Michael agreed, "but it would also end the fight." Greg lowered the papers. "At what cost?" "That's the question only you can answer," Michael said gently. Before Greg could respond, the courtroom doors opened, signaling they were minutes from continuing the hearing. He folded the offer but didn't put it away. His hand remained wrapped around the papers as he stepped back inside. The courtroom was packed. Ryan sat stiffly beside Lillian and Grace, though something in his posture looked different, tense, almost vulnerable. When the judge called for additional statements, Ryan unexpectedly rose. "I'd like to be heard," he said. The request surprised even Lillian. Ryan walked to the front, stood tall, then turned to face the room. His voice shook, not with anger this time but with something else entirely. "For years," he began, "I've felt overshadowed by my father. He was successful, bigger than life. And I never knew how to measure up." Greg felt the words slice through him. Ryan continued, "I thought he didn't see me, didn't care. I felt like the only way to prove myself was to take control of the estate, the legacy, everything he built. I thought maybe, if I could stand on what he created, I'd finally feel equal. The courtroom was silent. Ryan's eyes flicked toward Greg, almost pleading. "But I wasn't trying to hurt you on purpose, Dad. I just didn't know how else to be seen." Greg felt something inside him break, not from anger but from grief. The words he had wanted to hear for years were finally here, but they were wrapped in tragedy and legal filings. When court adjourned for recess, Greg stepped into the hallway again, needing air. Samantha followed quietly, her expression unreadable. "Greg," she said softly, "this offer, maybe it's the best way to end the destruction." He looked at her, noticing how distant her eyes had become. "You want me to take it?" "I want peace," she whispered. "For our family, for myself." She hesitated, then added, "I've thought about what life would look like without all this tension, without you so consumed by fighting. And I'm scared, Greg. I don't know how much more I can stay by your side if this continues." Her honesty hit him like a punch. She wasn't threatening him. She was unraveling, slowly and painfully, and he was losing her without even realizing it. After Samantha stepped away, Greg sank onto a bench and stared down at the settlement papers. His hands trembled. His legacy lay in those pages, but so did the last shreds of his relationships. He thought about the years he had prioritized business over bonding, the times he had mistaken providing for parenting. He thought about Ryan's childhood, moments he had missed, conversations he had avoided, walls he had built without realizing they were walls. Winning in court suddenly felt hollow. He needed clarity, so he called Emma. She arrived within minutes, her face full of concern. Greg handed her the settlement offer. She read it slowly, her brow furrowing. "Dad, this is extreme." "I know. What are you thinking?" she asked. Greg rubbed his forehead. "I'm thinking, maybe I've been holding on too tightly. Maybe I've been fighting for the past instead of the future, and it's killing the people I love." Emma's eyes softened. "Dad, you don't have to give everything away, but you do need to decide what matters most right now, your estate or your family." Greg inhaled deeply. Something shifted inside him, an epiphany, quiet but powerful. He realized he didn't need to win the legal battle to reclaim his legacy. He needed to win something far more fragile: his family's trust, his son's heart, his own sense of peace. Slowly, Greg folded the settlement papers and placed them on the bench beside him. "I'm done fighting for the past," he said quietly. "It's time to fight for what's left of my family." And for the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of clarity. Not victory, not defeat, but possibility. Greg sat in his study long after midnight, the settlement offer lying open in front of him like a wound that refused to close. He had fought so hard, pushed so fiercely, that he barely recognized the man he had become. But Ryan's words in court, raw, trembling with years of buried resentment, echoed louder than any legal argument. "I just wanted to be seen." Those words haunted him. By dawn, after hours of pacing and reliving memories he wished he could rewrite, Greg finally made a decision. Not out of defeat, not out of exhaustion, but out of something deeper, a clarity that had taken months of pain to form. He wasn't giving up the estate. He was giving up the fight. Not because Ryan deserved victory, but because Greg wanted a future where father and son could stand in the same room without lawyers acting as translators. He picked up the property papers and placed them neatly into a folder. His heart hammered, but there was a surprising sense of calm beneath the fear, a break in the storm, a fragile, emerging peace. When Samantha woke and found Greg in the kitchen holding the folder, her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. "What is that?" she asked. Greg met her eyes. "The estate papers." Samantha's shoulders tensed. "Greg, what are you doing?" "I'm giving them to Ryan," he said quietly. Her eyes widened with shock and hurt. "You're just handing everything over after all of this." Greg shook his head gently. "I'm not giving him everything. I'm giving him a chance. A chance for us to stop tearing this family apart." Samantha stepped back, her voice breaking. "No, this feels like surrender, like you're choosing him over our future." "I'm choosing peace," Greg replied softly, "for all of us." She turned away, wiping her eyes, struggling to understand. For months she had watched Greg fight tooth and nail. Seeing him step back now felt like whiplash. And yet beneath her frustration, a flicker of relief crossed her face, though she didn't voice it. Emma arrived later that morning and listened, as Greg explained his decision. Unlike Samantha, she didn't react with shock. She let out a long breath, almost relieved. "Dad," she said, placing a hand on his arm, "I know this isn't easy, but I think it's the right choice." "You do?" Greg asked, needing the reassurance more than he wanted to admit. Emma nodded. The fighting wasn't saving anything. This might. Her support steadied him, enough to call Ryan. When Ryan arrived at the estate a few hours later, he walked in guarded, expecting another confrontation. Grace followed closely behind, her eyes sharp with suspicion. Greg stood in the living room holding the folder. "Ryan," he said gently, "I need to talk to you alone." Grace stepped forward immediately. "If this is about the case." "It's not," Greg interrupted firmly. "Please, this is between me and my son." Grace hesitated, sensing something shifting beyond her control, but Ryan surprised her by nodding. "It's fine. I'll talk to him." She frowned but stepped out onto the porch. Ryan turned back to Greg, arms crossed out of habit more than hostility. "What's this about?" Greg held out the folder. "The estate papers." Ryan's expression changed, first confusion, then disbelief, then something softer, almost fragile. "You're giving them to me." Greg nodded, "On one condition." Ryan swallowed. "What condition?" "That we stop this war," Greg said, his voice steady. "No more legal threats, no more accusations, no more tearing each other apart." He paused. "I can rebuild money, I can rebuild assets, but I can't rebuild a son." Ryan looked down at the folder, his chest rising and falling. The shock in his posture slowly gave way to something Greg hadn't seen in months: emotion. "I thought you'd fight me forever," Ryan said quietly. "I almost did," Greg admitted, "and I was wrong." Ryan's shoulders softened, the defensiveness slipping away. "Dad, I thought you didn't care. I thought all you cared about was control." "I cared too much about control," Greg said, "and not enough about you. I'm sorry." Ryan's eyes glistened, though he blinked moisture away quickly. "I've been angry for a long time," he said. "Angry at you, angry at myself. I didn't know how to deal with it, so I turned it into this." Greg stepped closer. "We can fix this, Ryan, maybe not everything, but something." Grace re-entered quietly, sensing the tone had changed, and not in her favor. Her expression tightened, irritation flickering in her eyes. The plan she had meticulously guided was slipping out of her hands. Ryan noticed her shift and stepped slightly away from her, just an inch, but enough to reveal where his heart was leaning. "Dad," he said softly, "I don't know how to make all of this right, but I want to try." Greg felt the weight in his chest loosen, for the first time in months. The reconciliation wasn't complete, not yet. The scars were still raw, the wounds still fresh. But for the first time, father and son were facing the same direction, not opposite sides of a courtroom. It was a beginning. A fragile, hopeful beginning. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. The air was still heavy, yes, but no longer sharp with anger. It was the heaviness that follows a storm, quiet, uncertain, but hopeful in a way Greg hadn't felt in a long time. The days after Greg offered Ryan the estate papers were awkward at first. Father and son moved carefully around each other, testing the boundaries of their newly forming truce. Their conversations often began with long pauses, eyes lowered, breaths held. But slowly, inch by inch, they started to talk. Real conversations. Painful ones. Honest ones. One afternoon, they sat on the back porch, the same place Greg used to sit with Ryan when he was a child. Ryan stared out at the yard. "I wasn't angry just because of the estate," he admitted quietly. "I was angry because I felt like you never saw me unless it had something to do with work or expectations." Greg nodded slowly. "I thought providing opportunities was how I showed love. I didn't realize I was building a wall instead of a bridge." Ryan exhaled, a sound caught between frustration and relief. "I don't forgive everything yet, but I'm willing to try." Try. It wasn't a promise, but it was something Greg hadn't heard from his son in years. Meanwhile, Samantha watched these changes from a careful distance. She wanted to believe the shift was real, that Greg had truly let go of the obsession that had consumed him for months. But the hurt she carried didn't fade overnight. One evening she joined Greg in the living room, sitting beside him but not quite touching. "I'm glad things are improving with Ryan," she said softly. "Truly." Greg turned toward her. "I know I hurt you too, Sam. I shut you out, made you carry this family on your back while I fought a battle I didn't even understand." She looked at him, eyes soft but cautious. "I'm trying to forgive, Greg. I need to see consistency. I need to know this change isn't temporary." Greg nodded. "I'll prove it, not with words, just with how I live." Her silence wasn't rejection, it was contemplation, and for now that was enough. Greg made an effort, not a grand gesture but steady, intentional steps. Instead of burying himself in documents or strategy, he focused on being present, on listening, on showing Ryan he cared more about rebuilding than reclaiming. They met for coffee, walked the estate grounds together, discussed old memories, some warm, some painful. Ryan still struggled with trust. He flinched when conversations brushed close to conflict, his guard rising like reflex. But each time, Greg tried to meet him with patience instead of defensiveness. "I know I was the father you needed," Greg said during one of these talks, "but I want to learn how to be better now." Ryan hesitated before responding, his expression softer than before. "I appreciate that. It'll take time." Time. Patience. Humility. Greg finally understood those were the real investments a father made. Grace, however, sensed the shift and felt it like a threat. The power dynamic she had carefully helped craft was slipping. She watched Ryan become more reflective, less reactive, less dependent on her guidance. One evening, as they got into their car outside the estate, she asked quietly, "Are you sure you want this? To be part of a family that's still broken?" Ryan leaned back in his seat, staring ahead. "Grace, maybe they're broken because I didn't give them a chance." She looked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his voice. She had never seen him like this, uncertain, introspective, softened. And though she didn't say it aloud, she realized her influence might no longer be the driving force in his decisions. A few days later, Emma stepped in, ever the mediator, ever the heart of the family. "We need a dinner," she announced. "All of us. No lawyers, no documents, just a family trying to move forward." Greg agreed immediately. Ryan took longer but eventually nodded. Samantha hesitated but said yes. That evening tea. The dining room felt different. The table was set simply, no elaborate decorations, just warm food and quiet hope. Conversation started slow, with small comments about work, the weather, old memories. But by dessert, something deeper emerged. Ryan looked at Greg. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," he said, "but I want to find a better version of us." Greg nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Me too." No dramatic reconciliation, no tearful embrace. But a step. One step toward healing. As the night came to a close and Greg stood watching his family talk, really talk, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the wedding disaster. Possibility. The road ahead would be long, uncertain, full of bruised emotions and delicate rebuilding. But for the first time, Greg believed he hadn't lost everything. In fact, he was finally beginning to reclaim what mattered most. The sun filtered softly through the dining room windows, casting warm stripes of light across the table. It was the first morning in months where the Thompson house didn't feel suffocating under tension. Still, there was a heaviness, an uncertainty that clung to the air as Greg, Ryan, and Samantha sat together, each of them aware that the conversation ahead would shape the future of their family. Greg cleared his throat and rested both hands on the table, steady but nervous. "I asked you both to sit with me today," he began quietly, "because we need to talk about where we go from here. Not legally, not financially, as a family." Ryan sat back, arms uncrossed for once, a sign that he was trying, even if the effort felt new and unfamiliar. Samantha watched them both carefully, her expression calm but guarded. She wanted to believe in this moment, but trust wasn't something she could offer instantly anymore. Greg reached for a folder beside him and placed it on the table. "I've been working with a financial advisor these past few days," he said. "Not to protect the estate, but to rebuild it in a way that's fair, transparent, something I should have done years ago." Ryan's brows lifted slightly, surprised. Greg continued, "I want both you and Emma to have equal shares in what I've built. Not hidden, not controlled from behind a curtain, everything open." Samantha glanced at him, a flicker of something warm passing through her eyes, relief, maybe, or tentative pride. Ryan touched the edge of the folder. "I didn't know you were planning this," he said. Greg nodded. "I was. Not until I realized how much pain I caused by holding everything so tight. I thought protecting the assets was protecting you, but all it did was push you away." There was a long, quiet pause. Then Ryan exhaled, the air leaving him slow and heavy. "Dad, I need to be honest with you." His voice wavered slightly. "The property, the estate, it was never really about the money, not completely." Greg tensed. Samantha looked at her son gently, encouraging him to continue. Ryan swallowed. "I just wanted to feel seen. You built this empire and I always felt like a footnote in the story. I wanted to matter to you, to be valued, not just managed." He looked up, his eyes raw and vulnerable. "I wanted you to notice me." The words cracked something inside Greg. He leaned forward, voice thick. "Ryan, I should have shown you that you mattered, not just by providing for you, not by giving you responsibilities, by being present. I didn't know how to balance work and family, and you paid the price for that." Ryan blinked, his eyes glistening slightly. "I didn't know how to tell you what I felt, so I turned it into anger instead." Greg reached across the table. "Then let me promise you something now. I'm going to be here, truly here, not behind a desk, not buried in work, with you, with Emma, with your mother." Samantha's gaze softened. For the first time in months, she saw not the stubborn, hardened man she had been battling beside, but the husband she had loved for decades, finally breaking through the armor he had built around himself. "You've said things like this before," she whispered cautiously, "but this feels different. I hope it lasts." "It will," Greg said without hesitation. "Because I'm choosing you, our family, over the estate, over the business, over everything else." As they spoke, Grace arrived quietly, stepping into the doorway. Her presence shifted the air, and for a moment Ryan stiffened out of habit. But Grace didn't interrupt. Instead, she gave Ryan a small, measured look, one that held more resignation than influence. "Ryan," she said gently, I think I should step back a little." Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace stepped closer, her voice surprisingly soft. Your family, it's something you need to rebuild without me steering anything. I didn't realize how badly things had fractured until now, and I don't want to be the reason they don't heal." Ryan looked at her, surprised, but he nodded slowly. Grace placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, then left the doorway with a quiet understanding that things had shifted, for him, for all of them. Greg took a breath, letting the moment settle. "We're all scarred," he said, "but scars mean we survived something. Now we get to decide what we build from here." Ryan nodded. Samantha reached for Greg's hand, and for the first time in far too long they felt aligned, not perfectly, not entirely healed, but united in intention. They didn't pretend everything was fixed. They didn't pretend trust was fully restored. But they acknowledged the truth. They were willing to try. As they stood and began clearing the table together, Greg felt something warm settle into his chest. Hope. Quiet, steady, and long overdue. The past had wounded them deeply. But the future. For the first time in months, it felt possible. The morning air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine as Greg and Ryan stepped onto the winding trail behind the estate. It had been years since they'd walked this path together, years since they'd shared anything that resembled quiet companionship. Now, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they walked side by side, neither rushing nor retreating, letting the silence guide them before the words came. Ryan kicked at a loose stone on the path, his hands deep in his jacket pockets. "It's strange," he said finally, voice low, "being back here. I used to come out here alone when I was a kid, when I didn't know how to talk to you." Greg nodded, the weight of that confession settling deep in his chest. "I should have walked it with you more often," he admitted. "I thought giving you space was helping. I didn't realize it felt like distance." Ryan looked down at the fallen leaves beneath their feet. "I didn't realize how much I resented you, how much it twisted everything I did. I'm not proud of the person I became." Greg slowed, turning to face him fully. "We both failed in different ways," he said gently, "but failure doesn't have to be the end of the story." A gust of wind rustled through the branches overhead. Ryan looked up, meeting his father's eyes, the first time he truly held the gaze without anger or defensiveness. Greg continued, voice soft but steady, "Forgiveness isn't easy, Ryan. It's not simple. It's not quick. But it's the only way either of us can heal." Ryan swallowed hard. "Do you really forgive me for everything?" Greg didn't hesitate. "Yes, and I hope someday you forgive me too." There was no dramatic hug, no tears, no grand gesture. Just two men, standing on a trail where they had both once felt lost, finally finding a small sense of direction. They continued walking, speaking about the past with a mixture of regret and acceptance, and about the future with a cautious kind of hope. They talked about the estate, not as property to be controlled, but as something to be managed responsibly together. They discussed boundaries, expectations, and what rebuilding trust might look like. And for the first time, Ryan spoke not from a place of demand, but of introspection. By the time they returned to the house, the family had begun to gather for a small holiday celebration. It wasn't elaborate, just a simple meal, soft music playing, warm lights spilling from the windows. But it felt meaningful in a way no extravagant event ever had. Samantha stood in the kitchen arranging candles on the table when Greg walked in. She glanced at him, searching his face the way she had been doing for weeks, trying to determine whether the man standing in front of her was truly the one she had loved for decades. "How was the walk?" she asked. "Good," Greg said with a small smile. "Really good." There was a hesitance in her eyes, but also something brighter, something that looked a little like hope. She touched his arm gently. "I'm glad. Maybe this is the beginning of something better." "Maybe it is," Greg agreed. As the family gathered, laughter came slowly at first, quiet and soft like a flame being protected from the wind. Emma teased Ryan about his childhood haircut. Samantha and Greg exchanged small smiles across the table. Ryan offered to help serve the food instead of waiting to be served. Even Grace, attending more as an observer than a participant, seemed to recognize the shift and stepped back gracefully, allowing Ryan to lead with his own choices. Greg watched it all unfold, the room glowing with warmth, and felt something unfamiliar blooming in his chest: gratitude. He had spent years equating legacy with wealth, property, and success. But as he watched Ryan speak softly with Emma, watched Samantha relax into a quiet smile, watched his fractured world begin to mend, he understood the truth. Legacy wasn't built on land or money. Legacy was built on moments like these. On forgiveness. On love rediscovered. On choosing healing over pride. Near the end of the evening, Ryan approached Greg, hands in his pockets again, but with a gentler posture than before. "Dad," he said, clearing his throat then. "KU for being patient, for giving me a chance to fix things." Greg placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "We're fixing it together." Later, as they walked outside to say goodbye to guests, father and son stepped into the cool night air. They paused under the soft glow of the porch light, the world quiet around them. They didn't need more words. They simply shared a look, steady, warm, and healing. Then they walked forward, side by side. A bond reforged. A future rebuilt. A testament to forgiveness and to love that refused to die.